You should be ashamed of yourself." My mother said it out loud in the middle of church, not in the hallway, not after the service, not in a whisper behind a hymnal. Right there, between the final prayer and the first verse of the closing hymn, with half the congregation still standing and the other half already turning to see who had made enough of a sound to deserve that tone. Then my father stood up beside her and said, "She's not the daughter we raised." People turned. Some stared openly. Some tried not to. Some looked at me first, then at my parents, then at the cross at the front of the sanctuary, the way people do when they want God to absorb the discomfort they are too cowardly to interrupt. No one defended me. I stood there alone in the aisle with a church bulletin folded in my hand so tightly the paper edge cut into my palm. And what none of them knew, not my mother, not my father, not the women in the third pew who always tracked everybody's sins like weather reports, was that someone had already recorded everything. That wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was the silence after. Not the words themselves. Those, at least, had shape. Public humiliation is almost easier to survive when it arrives clearly, but the silence that followed was the kind that makes you understand how quickly a room can decide your shame belongs to you now. My mother was still holding her Bible against her chest when she said it. Black, leather, gold-edged pages, her name stamped in tiny letters at the bottom from a women's retreat my father had paid for years earlier. She always carried it like a credential, more than a comfort. Her thumb was tucked between Psalms and Proverbs, as if Scripture itself had paused to stand with her while she corrected me in front of the whole church. My father did not look angry. That mattered. He looked disappointed in the way men like him train themselves to look when they want their cruelty mistaken for leadership. His jaw was set. His tie was still straight. He had one hand on the pew in front of him and the other resting near my mother's elbow, not to calm her, but to steady the performance. I was 20 feet from the front, halfway back to my seat after stepping out during the invitation hymn, because I had not wanted another woman from the prayer circle cornering me about healing family wounds in the vestibule. I had barely made it back inside before my mother decided the sanctuary was the right place to finish what she had started in private 6 months earlier. Around us, people waited. No one said, "This is church." No one said, "Not here." No one said, "Stop." Because in our church, appearances were often treated like obedience, and my parents had always been very good at making their control look like conviction. I did not answer right away. That surprised me later, not because I was strong, but because I was not. My heart was hitting so hard I could feel it under the pearl cross necklace my grandmother gave me when I turned 16. I could hear the blood in my ears louder than the organ. My mouth had gone dry. There was a little girl 2 pews over holding a pink ribboned Bible and staring at me like she had never seen an adult woman publicly scolded before. Still, I did not answer. Because families like mine train silence into you early. They teach you which reactions will later be used as evidence. They make sure your pain is only acceptable if it can be carried neatly enough not to interfere with their version of righteousness. My mother mistook my silence for submission. She took one small step closer and lowered her voice just enough to make it worse. "You embarrassed us," she said. That line landed harder because it was familiar. Not the wording exactly. The structure. Everything in my family eventually became about embarrassment. Not truth, not harm, not care. Embarrassment. As if what happened between us only mattered once other people could see it. My father added, "You've lost your way." There it was, not just shame, narrative. I was not simply being corrected. I was being publicly defined. The choir director looked away first, then Mrs. Talbot from the front row, then Deacon Harris, who had known me since I was a child and once told me after youth choir that I had a steady spirit. No one wanted to be the first person to choose between my parents' moral authority and the possibility that what they were doing was ugly. If you've ever been humiliated in front of people you trusted, you already know how a room can become a verdict before anyone says another word. I finally looked at my mother and said, "You didn't have to do this here." And she gave me the look she always gave me when I accidentally said the true thing too plainly in public. "Yes," she said, "I did." That was when I understood this was not a slip, not emotion, not grief, not a mother losing control in a spiritual moment. This was chosen. The pastor had just stepped down from the pulpit. The congregation was unsettled enough that everyone was still in place. The musicians had paused because no one wanted to start the final hymn over the sound of family damage. My mother had used the exact second when the most eyes would be on us and the fewest people would feel permitted to intervene. It was strategic. That realization steadied me more than comfort would have. My father looked around the room once, saw that he had an audience, and finished the job. "We didn't raise you to live like this." Like this. That was the line he used whenever he wanted to say something cruel without specifying it enough to be accountable. It had followed me for months in church hallways and parking lots and calls from relatives who were just checking in. Like this. Dating a divorced man once in college. Like this. Moving into a one-bedroom apartment before marriage because my lease ended early and the wedding was only 5 weeks away. Like this. Questioning why my parents kept introducing Daniel as the contractor instead of my fiancé. Like this. And now, in the sanctuary, it meant whatever everyone else wanted it to mean. Immorality, rebellion, failure, disrespect. That is what made church such an effective weapon in the wrong hands. People could fill your silence with their own fears and call it discernment. I gripped the bulletin harder. It had the morning order of service on one side and the prayer list on the other. My mother's name was under hospitality committee. My father's under building fund. Mine was nowhere. It had not been for months, I had noticed. I just had not said it out loud, because once you realize you are being quietly moved out of a place, naming it often speeds up the removal. There was one more silence. Then the pastor's wife, standing near the side aisle with her purse over one arm, said, "Maybe this can wait." It was a weak rescue, but it was the only one offered. My mother smiled without looking at her and said, "No, it can't." That was the moment I stopped, hoping someone else would save the room. And somewhere behind the last row, unseen by most of us then, a hand lowered a phone after recording everything from the first sentence to the last. If you've ever been humiliated in a place that was supposed to feel safe, you'll understand this. In our family, being right mattered less than looking right. That was the rule no one wrote down because no one had to. We lived inside it so long it became air. My mother never called herself controlling. She called herself prayerful. My father never called himself image conscious. He called himself protective. They built their reputation inside the church the same way they built everything else, through consistency, service, and a very disciplined refusal to let anyone see what happened when the room was private. We were the family who brought casseroles after surgeries. The family who never missed Sunday unless there was fever. The family who chaired fundraisers, signed sympathy cards, and kept folded cash in envelopes for missionaries we would never meet. We were also the family that punished deviation like it was moral failure. It started with small things when I was younger. Skirts too short by my mother's standards. Tone too sharp by my father's. Questions too honest in Sunday school. Friendships my parents considered confusing influences. Nothing big enough to call abuse if you told it badly. Everything sharp enough to shape a girl who learned early that acceptance came with conditions, and conditions were most dangerous when they looked holy. The church helped with that. Not because the church itself was evil. It wasn't. I still won't let them have that simplification. Church was where my grandmother taught me the alto line to old hymns, where Mrs. Keller slipped peppermints to restless children in service, where the sanctuary smelled like lemon polish and old wood, and the air conditioning always clicked too loudly before summer revivals, where I learned that scripture could comfort and not only accuse, but it was also the place my parents understood best as a stage. My mother loved a witness, my father loved a reputation, and religion gave them both. By the time I was 32, the gap between what was true and what looked true had become almost impossible to explain to people who had only ever known us under fluorescent fellowship hall lights. Daniel made that gap visible just by standing beside me. He was not who my parents told people they had prayed for. He worked construction, managed large crews, knew building systems better than my father knew his own children, had hands roughened by years of real work and a calm voice that never got louder just because someone richer was in the room. He did not know how to perform polite inferiority around people who thought professionalism only counted if it came in a suit. My parents hated that immediately. At first, they hid it under concern. Construction is unstable. That kind of work is hard on the body. You're still young enough to choose differently. Choose differently. I remember that phrase too, as if Daniel were not a man but a road I could still avoid before it lowered me permanently. He had a truck with a cracked corner on the dashboard, steel-toed boots lined neatly by the door, and the kind of practical kindness that made my family look extravagant and hollow at the same time. He remembered which days I had trouble sleeping. He refilled my windshield washer fluid without telling me. He stood up when older women entered a room and never made a speech about respect, because for him, respect was not branding. It was habit. My mother could not forgive him for making decency look simple, because when decency is simple, performance becomes obvious. Have you ever been judged by people who called it concern, when what they really meant was that you were no longer easy to control? The first time my mother used church language against me over him, we were in the fellowship hall after Wednesday Bible study. Women were stacking cookie trays. Someone was laughing too loudly near the coffee urn. She took me by the elbow and said, "You need to pray for discernment." I knew what she meant. Not pray. Discernment. End it. When I didn't, the language got harsher. He is not equally yoked to this family. You are inviting struggle into your life. People are beginning to ask questions. People. That crowd again. The invisible congregation my mother carried everywhere like a jury she had permanent access to. The pearl cross necklace became important around then. My grandmother gave it to me on my 16th birthday and said, "Don't wear this for other people. Wear it when you need to remember what belongs between you and God." I wore it through college, through my first office job, through the months before my wedding when my mother started acting as if every church brunch and bridal shower required her to manage the optics of my choices. The necklace was small enough to disappear under most sweaters, but I always knew when it was there. I touched it when my mother cornered me in church hallways. I touched it when my father used scripture like leverage over dinner. I touched it on the Sunday he prayed, from the front pew, that our children would not be led astray by pride and stubbornness, and half the congregation looked at me because everyone already knew who had become the family concern. It didn't stop after that Sunday. That matters. Public humiliation is never just one moment in families like mine. It is a permission slip. After the sanctuary incident, people did not rush toward me in the parking lot. They did not ask if I was all right. They did what church communities often do when image and discomfort collide. They softened around my parents and stiffened around me. Not aggressively. Worse, politely. Women who used to hug me after service started touching only my elbow. Men who once asked Daniel about jobs and weather started nodding at him from a distance instead of stepping over. The older Sunday school teacher who had known my grandmother said, "We're praying for peace," with the kind of expression people use when they have already accepted the family-approved version of events. My mother had a phrase she repeated to anyone who got close enough to hear it. "She's lost her way." That line spread faster than I expected because it was church perfect. Moral enough to sound compassionate, vague enough to fit anything. People could hear what they wanted in it and still feel spiritual for not asking specifics. My father's version was colder. "She's embarrassed herself and doubled down." Embarrassment again. That was his favorite frame because embarrassment made everything sound self-inflicted. No one said, "Your parents publicly shamed you in church for not living according to their class and image expectations." They said, "We heard things have been difficult." They said, "Your mother is heartbroken." They said, "Maybe time apart is what everyone needs." Time apart is a beautiful phrase when what you really mean is social isolation with a Christian accent. I stopped going for 2 Sundays. That was the concrete consequence I felt in my bones. Not because I had lost faith, because I could not yet sit under stained glass where people had watched me be publicly corrected like an unclean thought and then acted as if my discomfort were the disruption. On the 3rd Sunday, I parked across the street and stayed in the car through the opening hymn before leaving without going inside. I told Daniel I wasn't ready. He said, "Then don't go where they get to use your pain as proof." That line stayed with me. He never asked me to reconcile, never pushed me to forgive, never mocked my need to grieve the place as well as the people. That was another reason my parents hated him. He respected wounds they wanted reorganized into obedience. The church bulletin became its own object after that. I kept one folded in my purse for weeks, the same one from the day my mother shamed me. I told myself I hadn't thrown it out because I forgot. That was not true. I kept it because the crease down the middle had my thumbprint pressed into it so hard the paper stayed bent even when flattened. It was proof that what happened had shape, date, place. Order of worship. Public record. By then, I was starting to understand I would need proof. I just didn't know what kind. Have you ever felt judged in a place that was supposed to feel safe? At some point, I started believing them. Not completely. Not enough to leave Daniel or confess to sins I had not committed. But enough that shame became ambient. That is what humiliation does when it's tied to community. It doesn't always need you to agree with the accusation. It only needs you to feel contaminated by being seen inside it. For weeks after my mother said, "You should be ashamed of yourself in church," I heard it in ordinary moments. While unloading groceries, while brushing my teeth, while folding laundry, while putting gas in my car and seeing my own reflection in the station window. "You should be ashamed." It sounded different in my head than it did in the sanctuary. Less sharp, more intimate, which made it more dangerous. My parents no longer had to say it. The room was echoing inside me for them. Daniel noticed before I admitted anything. One night, I was rereading an email from my aunt that somehow managed to be both supportive and subtly aligned with my mother's narrative. It contained the phrase, "Everyone's worried about your spiritual posture," which is exactly the kind of church language that wounds while pretending to kneel when he took the laptop gently out of my hands and closed it. "You're letting them preach to you when they're not even in the room," he said. I cried then, not because he was wrong, because he was exactly right. What would you do if everyone around you started believing a version of you that wasn't true, and some part of you started believing it too? The social isolation was not dramatic enough to explain quickly, which is part of why it worked. I wasn't banned. I was bypassed. No one said, "Don't come to the women's breakfast." The invitations simply stopped arriving. No one said, "We don't want you in the Christmas music service." My name just wasn't on the volunteer list when it came out. No one told me to stop teaching 5th grade Sunday school. The curriculum packets simply went to someone else, and when I asked, the administrator smiled tightly and said, "We thought you might need a season." A season. The church has 1,000 gentle words for exclusion if the people doing it smile long enough. My mother's narrative was doing exactly what she wanted. Not explosive. Durable. I heard from one woman that I had chosen a worldly life. From another that my parents were carrying such a heavy burden with grace. One deacon's wife asked whether Daniel had encouraged distance from accountability, which was a sophisticated church way of asking whether he was the kind of man who led women away from family and faith. He had done neither. He had simply not fit the class script. That is what made the footage so important when it finally appeared. Not because it was dramatic, because it was clean. I found out about it from Mrs. Keller. She ran the church media booth and had for years. Tiny silver hair, reading glasses on a chain. Always wore navy cardigans, no matter the season. She was one of those women people underestimate because she moves quietly and takes notes on everything. She called me on a Thursday afternoon. I almost didn't answer because I assumed it was another concerned church voice preparing to wrap judgment in prayer language. Instead, she said, "I think there's something you should see." Her tone was not soft enough to be pity and not hard enough to be alarm. It was the tone of someone used to handling facts carefully. I drove to her house that evening. She let me in, sat me at her kitchen table, and set a phone between us. "I shouldn't have kept this to myself this long," she said, but I didn't understand what they were going to do with it. "What is it?" "The service backup." It took me a second. Our church live streamed Sunday services and archived backup recordings from the side aisle camera whenever the main feed glitched. Most people forgot that because the camera itself was small and high-mounted. But it caught more than sermons. It caught movement in the pews, last prayers, altar calls, hallway spillover, anything that happened inside the sanctuary frame. Mrs. Keller tapped the screen. The video opened. There I was, standing in the aisle with the bulletin in my hand. My mother turning toward me. My father rising. The little girl with the pink Bible in the third pew. The entire room frozen around us. For the first time, I had the truth. Not my version. Not theirs. Just the truth. I watched my mother say, "You should be ashamed of yourself." I watched my father follow with, "She's not the daughter we raised." I watched people turn. I watched myself stand there without anyone stepping in. I watched my mother continue after the pastor's wife tried weakly to stop it. And then I watched something I had missed in the moment because I was too far inside my own humiliation to see the whole room. Faces. Not agreement. Discomfort. Shock. Embarrassment. Not everyone was with my parents. They were just silent. That distinction mattered more than I expected, because shame had made me remember the sanctuary as unanimous. The footage proved it wasn't. Mrs. Keller said, "They told people afterward you provoked it." I turned to her. She looked tired, angry in the restrained way of women who have spent too long watching respectable people misuse spiritual language as camouflage. "That isn't what happened," she said. There it was, the line I had needed from someone. Not sympathy, not concern. Truth. I didn't know what to do with it yet. That was the hard part. People who have never had real proof imagine that getting it solves the problem immediately. It doesn't. First, it creates a different one. Now you know exactly what happened. Now you know the lie is documented. Now you have to decide whether exposing it heals anything or only detonates what is left of a community you once loved. Mrs. Keller said, "I can't make this choice for you." I nodded. "But if they keep using church to damage you," she added, "then church should not be where the truth disappears." I drove home with the footage in my bag on a flash drive she had copied from the archive. The drive was black with a red cap and small enough to disappear in my palm. Object. Proof. Weapon. Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table when I got back. Boots off, socks half gray with job site dust, eating reheated chili from a bowl. He looked up and knew immediately something had shifted. "What happened?" I held up the drive. Someone recorded it. He did not ask whether I was sure. Did not ask whether maybe it would be better to let it go. Did not perform wisdom before understanding. He asked, "Do you want to watch it again?" That is love, not solving. Witnessing with permission. We watched it twice. The second time, he paused right after my father said, "She's not the daughter we raised," and pointed to the back right corner of the frame. Deacon Harris stepping forward half an inch, then stopping when my mother kept talking, the pastor's wife turning. Two women near the choir loft looking stunned. "Not everyone was with them," he said. "No," I answered. "They just weren't with me." That was the real midpoint. Not the existence of the footage. The collapse of the lie that everyone had agreed with my parents. Silence wasn't innocence, but it wasn't unanimity either. That gave me room to act. What would you do if the truth had been recorded and the people hurting you didn't know it yet? If you had proof like this, would you use it? They were still winning, and they didn't even know it. That was the infuriating part. Even after I saw the footage, even after Mrs. Keller confirmed what happened in the room and what had been said afterward, my parents continued operating as if they owned the moral version of events. My mother kept serving on hospitality. My father still passed the offering plates with that solemn look men wear when they confuse consistency with virtue. People still greeted them as if the sanctuary humiliation had been a painful but understandable family correction instead of what it actually was. Public spiritual violence wrapped in concern. My absence was helping them. That realization took me longer than it should have. I had stayed away partly because I was hurt, partly because I was ashamed, and partly because every church instinct in me had been trained to believe withdrawal was more righteous than conflict. But while I was protecting the peace, they were protecting the lie. The next invitation came from the church itself. Homecoming Sunday, special luncheon after service. A testimony video segment about families restored by grace. My mother sent the flyer to my aunt, who sent it to me with a message that felt accidental and wasn't. Maybe this would be a good day to come back. Come back, as if I had drifted, as if the issue were my wounded feelings and not my parents' public disgrace work done in a sanctuary. I stared at the flyer on my phone for a long time. Then I texted Mrs. Keller one question. "Will the service team be there?" She replied almost immediately. Yes. That was when the shape of the reversal became clear. Not revenge, not confrontation. Exposure in the same moral ecosystem where the lie had been planted. I did not want the footage online first. That mattered to me. Viral humiliation as entertainment was not the same thing as truth restored in the place where the damage began. If the video went public eventually, that would be one thing. But first, I wanted the room. The room that watched. The room that stayed quiet. The room my parents believed they still controlled. Daniel let me talk through it twice, without interrupting. Then he said, "If you do this, do it clean." He was right. No ambush email. No social post. No dramatic trailer to relatives. Just truth. At the right time. In the right room. Mrs. Keller became the calm truth delivery character because she had the one thing my parents could not easily attack without exposing themselves further: institutional neutrality. She ran the church media system. She had the archived file. She had no history of gossip and no appetite for family drama. She also had a line I would later think about for months. "People forgive cruelty too quickly when it arrives dressed for Sunday," she said. On homecoming Sunday, I wore the pearl cross necklace and a navy dress my grandmother once told me made me look steady. Daniel wore a clean white shirt and the dark jacket he used for funerals and city permit meetings, the one that made people stop assuming they could size him up in under 10 seconds. We sat near the back, not hidden, not announced. My parents saw us before the first hymn and both did the same thing at once. They looked startled, then immediately corrected into composure, because public religion trains people to recover fast when their control is challenged. My mother came over before the service. "I think this may not be the right day," she said. That was almost funny. I looked at her and answered, "For who?" She smiled tightly. "Let's not make a scene. Not let's talk. Not I'm sorry. Not I was wrong. Let's not make a scene." Because scene was always the thing they feared most. Not sin, not injury. Scene. Daniel said nothing. He did not need to. He had learned what I had. In rooms like these, the person least interested in performance often ends up the strongest. My father approached next, hands in his pockets, all fake patience and contained irritation. "We can discuss things privately after service." "No," I said. His eyes hardened, not because I was loud, because I was direct. I could feel people watching already. Homecoming always packed the church. Old families visiting from out of state. Former youth choir kids now with children of their own. The room my parents loved most because it gave them the largest possible audience for decency. "Good," the service began. I heard almost none of it. Not because I was nervous, because I was clear. There is a point beyond panic where your body simply aligns behind one decision and waits for the moment it chose days earlier. The pastor finished his sermon. The choir sang. Announcements began. Then came the testimony segment about restored homes. Right on schedule, the media screen dropped. Mrs. Keller was in the booth. She had told me there would be one clean insertion point before the luncheon slideshow. If telling the truth meant breaking the room, would you still do it? I had asked Daniel the night before. He looked at me and said, "If the room needed breaking, yes." The first image that appeared on the screen was not the sanctuary footage. It was a title card, March 17 Service Archive. That detail mattered more than you'd think. Date, record, no editorialization, no emotional language. Just the institutional fact that this was archived church material. People shifted. My mother turned around first. Then the video began. No music, no narration, no explanation. Just the sanctuary, me in the aisle, the bulletin, my mother, my father, the room, and then, over the speakers, as clear and unforgiving as memory never is. "You should be ashamed of yourself." People froze. My father half stood. Mrs. Keller's voice came over the microphone from the side, calm and precise. That's not what happened the way it was later described. She did not say more than that. She didn't need to. The footage kept running. "She's not the daughter we raised." No one moved. The entire congregation watched the same moment my parents had spent months editing by hand. That was the power shift. Not my anger, not their embarrassment, the simple destruction of narrative control. Would you stay silent after that? Or let the whole room sit in what they had done? What happens when the truth can't be controlled anymore? The room did not erupt. I think some part of me expected gasps, shouting, righteous interruptions, something cinematic enough to match the months of humiliation that had led us there. But real collapse rarely looks like that. It looks like stillness. It looks like your mother lowering her Bible hand because the prop no longer works. It looks like your father standing halfway and then sitting back down because authority has nowhere clean to land. It looks like people who had been comfortable in vagueness suddenly forced to choose what they can see with their own eyes over what they were told in parking lots and prayer chains. The video ended on the same freeze of me in the aisle, bulletin in hand, before cutting to black. No one clapped. No one coughed. Even the children were quiet. I turned and looked at my parents for the first time since it began. My mother had gone pale in a way makeup cannot fix. Her mouth was set, but her eyes had lost that polished certainty she carried into church every Sunday. My father's face looked older than it had 30 seconds earlier, not because he had been punished, because he had been seen. Mrs. Keller lowered the mic. The pastor stepped forward slowly, and I could see in his face the same thing I had seen in the footage on the women's faces the first time around. Discomfort, giving way to recognition. He did not defend them. That mattered. He did not defend me either, not in a grand public way. I almost respected that. He simply said, "We'll take a few minutes before the luncheon." That was church language for, "The room has broken and no one knows how to tape it back together with prayer language quickly enough." My mother moved toward me first. Of course she did. Even then, even exposed in front of the congregation, she still believed proximity might help her regain control of the narrative before it escaped the building entirely. "How dare you?" she whispered. Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "Why would you do this?" Not, "I can explain." How dare you? There it was again. Her truest religion. Not faith. Rank. I looked at her and said, very quietly, "You should be ashamed." The memory hook returned exactly where it belonged. Not screamed, not performed, just returned. Her eyes widened not because the words were harsh, but because they were hers. People like my mother are always most injured by hearing their own cruelty spoken back without trembling. My father stepped in then, but not to comfort her, to salvage something. "This was unnecessary," he said. I almost smiled. "No," I said. "What was unnecessary was using church to do that to me." He had no answer that could survive witnesses. Around us, the congregation had begun moving again, but differently now. Not casual, not comfortable. Mrs. Talbot, who had not met my eyes for months, looked straight at me and then away with visible shame. Deacon Harris approached Daniel first, not me, shook his hand once, and said, "I'm sorry." It was not enough, but it was true. And at that point, truth mattered more than proportion. One of the younger women from Bible study came up crying and said, "We thought," then stopped, because the rest of the sentence would have required admitting too much about how easily she had believed my parents. I spared her. "It's all right," I said. It wasn't. But not every correction needs to become a trial. What I wanted was not endless confession. It was the death of the lie. That had already happened. By the time we got to the parking lot, the video had been texted to 3 people outside the building. Not by me. That is how these things move now. Someone in the media booth had sent it to a spouse. Someone at the spouse's table had sent it to a cousin. By that afternoon, it had crossed church boundaries entirely. Community Facebook groups. Private message chains. A former youth leader now living in another state. The very networks my parents once relied on to distribute vague moral concern were now carrying evidence they could not sermonize over. The footage went viral enough for our town. That is the truth. Not national news, not millions of views, but in a community built on church, school, local business, and memory, viral doesn't need strangers. It only needs the right people to stop protecting the wrong version. My mother called 11 times that afternoon. My father called twice. My aunt sent one message. I should have said something that day. That one hurt the most because it was the most honest. Daniel drove us home in silence until we turned onto our street. Then he asked, "How do you feel?" I looked down at the church bulletin still in my lap. Same folded crease. Same service order. Same list of announcements and prayer requests and volunteer acknowledgments. The same piece of paper that had once felt like a record of my humiliation now felt like something else. Proof that the day had happened exactly where I remembered it. "Lighter," I said. It wasn't joy. I want to be very clear about that. This did not feel like revenge. It did not restore my place in that church. It did not undo the weeks I spent doubting my own memory, or the months I avoided pews that once felt holy. It did not turn my parents into repentant people, or make the congregation suddenly brave. What it did was simpler and more important. It made their version stop working. And once that happened, I no longer had to spend private energy resisting a public lie. The room had seen it. The footage had traveled. The burden of proof no longer lived inside my body alone. If this story hit close to home, tell me where you're watching from. I left that church quietly after that. Not in scandal, not in triumph. Just in clarity, some places are sacred until the wrong people learn how to weaponize them, and then you have to decide whether your peace requires staying and rebuilding or leaving before your spirit gets confused by the architecture. For me, it meant leaving, not faith. The building, the performance, the weekly contact with people who said, "We all make mistakes," when what they meant was that my parents had simply been too visible in theirs. I found another church 6 months later in a different part of town where no one knew my last name fast enough to attach it to theirs. The first Sunday there, an older usher handed me a bulletin and smiled in the ordinary way people smile when they have no idea how much damage a small act of welcome can repair. I nearly cried before the first hymn. The pearl cross necklace is still mine. I still wear it, but now when I touch it, I hear my grandmother's voice instead of my mother's. Not shame. Belonging. Daniel and I never discussed helping my parents again because there was nothing to discuss. When people ask whether I regret exposing them, what they usually mean is, do you regret making them live inside public consequence? No. I regret that the footage had to exist. I regret that a sanctuary was used like a courtroom. I regret that so many people were willing to let politeness stand in for courage. But I do not regret the truth. They wanted me to feel ashamed. In the end, they were the ones everyone saw.